Okay, Allison, let's start. I'm gonna introduce you and then I will pass you the floor, okay? Hello, everyone. Welcome to another talk in our webinar series. This webinar is also being streamed live on YouTube. You can find the link on our website or access it on our YouTube channel /LIneA MCTI. Today, we have Allison Noble from the Arizona State University talking about galaxy clusters over cosmic time. Allison, thank you very much for coming, and the floor is yours.
Great, thanks so much for having me. It's really nice to be able to talk to you guys all over this Zoom webinar, although obviously going to Brazil would have been nice to visit as well. So today I'm going to be talking about using the Atacama Large Millimeter Array to dissect galaxies in the heart of galaxy clusters over cosmic time. So I'm going to be talking about galaxies that are currently falling onto the cluster for the first time, and all the way to the heart of the galaxy cluster where the brightest cluster galaxy resides. So I'm mostly going to be focusing on new observations of molecular gas and star formation, and really trying to highlight how ALMA has opened up a new window into this discovery space. So I want to start with highlighting some of the students and postdocs who have been working with me on various ALMA-related projects. So on the left, there's Mrudella Gobel and Kyle Massengill, who are both PhD students at ASU. William Kramer is a new postdoc at ASU working with me. And the three of them are really gonna, the projects they're working on, I'll be focusing on in the first half of the talk. And then on the right-hand side, there's Anjali Ramesh, who's a brand new PhD student at ASU, and Delaney Dunn, who I've been working with over the summer, and she was an undergraduate at McGill University and just graduated there. And I'll be focusing on projects they've worked on or will be working on in the second half of the talk. So one of the fundamental puzzles in galaxy evolution pertains to the detailed physics of both the gas and the stars and how these processes come together to form a complex ecosystem of a galaxy over time. And this process is known as the baryon cycle. So in our basic understanding, the baryon cycle begins with gas secretion from the outer halo of the galaxy. This gas can cool and eventually settle onto the galaxy disk, where it can collapse into molecular clouds, which then go on to fragment and fuel star formation. These stars subsequently die, some of them supernova. And then finally, you have outflows in the form of either these winds from stars, so stellar winds, or jets from an active galactic nucleus in the galaxy that can eject material and gas back out into the outer areas of the halo, and then it gets recycled for a new generation of stars, forming this entire cyclical process, which is why we call it the baryon cycle. The outstanding questions about this baryon cycle really span all scales of astrophysics. So going all the way from the smallest scales of molecular cloud formation to galactic scales of star formation, AGN and dark matter halos, and large scale structure. So I won't be covering all of these topics and questions, obviously, in my talk today, but I'm really going to try to focus on those top upper three and the bottom middle. So trying to understand gas accretion and the mode of star formation in brightest cluster galaxies and how these brightest cluster galaxies grow over time, so the growth of the most massive galaxies. And then also using the infalling population in galaxy clusters to understand the efficiency of star formation. So this relationship between the gas surface density and the star formation rate within a galaxy. And then subsequently how that can quench in a cluster environment. So answering all of these questions really requires getting both spatially resolved studies of both the gas and star forming components within galaxies, but also eventually you want to get statistical studies of these global galaxy parameters so that you're not looking at just single systems. So these kind of global galaxy parameters that govern or dictate galaxy evolution that I'm talking about are environments, mass, and time. So by environments, I mean the environment that the galaxy lives in. So is this galaxy isolated with very few neighbors nearby, known as a field galaxy, or is it in a rare region of a dense galaxy cluster, where there are many other galaxies surrounding it that can influence its evolution, or it can be something in between, right? Like if you have a group type environment, which is not quite as dense as a galaxy cluster. By mass, I'm talking about how both the stellar mass and the halo mass of these galaxies. So dwarf galaxies look very different and have a very different environmental history or cosmic history versus something like the dominant galaxy within a galaxy cluster. So this brightest cluster galaxy, which I'll come back to a little bit later, which is one of the most massive galaxies in the universe. And then finally, how does time affect these galaxy parameters? So if you're looking at galaxies at low redshift, they look very different than looking at galaxies during what we call the cosmic noon of star formation. So this is occurring something like 10 billion years ago when the cosmic star formation rate of the universe really peaked around redshifts 2 or so. So my research interests primarily lie at the intersection of these three axes, but then focusing on the extreme end of each of these parameters. So focusing on this right-hand side of studying massive galaxies in these high density environments within clusters and trying to probe back to the peak epoch of star formation. So I study these parameters primarily through a lens of molecular gas, dust, and star formation, and really trying to get at the spatially resolved observations of these components, which is now becoming feasible with telescopes like ALMA. So for me, I think this is an observationally exciting regime. Clusters are very rare, and we're now only finally pushing the frontier to these higher redshift systems. So it means there's a lot of discovery potential as we investigate these extreme ends of all of these parameters. So the main question we want to answer then is how each of these parameters, environment, mass, and time, are influencing galaxy evolution. And there is a covariance between all of these parameters, which can complicate things as well. So if we look at galaxies in a color magnitude or color mass diagram shown on the bottom here, you see that there's this clear bimodality in the galaxy populations, looking at their color and stellar mass. So these two different populations on this diagram are called the blue cloud and the red sequence. And depending whether a galaxy is in one population or the other, it has very different properties already, because we know that there are these correlations between these parameters that I've discussed. So for instance, galaxies in the blue cloud are typically have young star forming populations, stellar populations. They are more common in field environments and isolated environments. They typically have lower masses, as you can see on the color mass diagram. And they're also more prevalent at early times when during this peak epoch of star formation in the universe. And then of course, galaxies on the red sequence have the opposite properties. So sometimes we can call this the red and dead sequence. These are often quiescent galaxies. Clusters are known, galaxy clusters are known to have more red and dead galaxies or elliptical galaxies that are often higher in mass and are what we see kind of at later times or at lower redshifts. So I want to, as I hinted at before, I'm going to break the talk into two different parts. So in the first part of the talk, I'm really going to be focusing on this environment parameter. So I'll be looking at a few projects studying molecular gas in galaxy clusters or in cluster galaxies at redshift 1.6. Focusing on all ALMA observations. So here I'll be highlighting some of the results we get by studying molecular gas in star formation, and in particular at spatially resolved resolutions. In the second part of the talk, I'll then fold in these two other axes, both mass and time, in the sense that I'll be moving from that infalling population of cluster galaxies to the most massive galaxies that live at the heart of the galaxy cluster. So these are the brightest cluster galaxies, and some of the studies that I'm going to be highlighting here are, well, they're in progress, so keep that in mind. But I'm also going to try to show a few studies that are probing a range of redshifts, so going through cosmic time and trying to understand the growth of these brightest cluster galaxies. All right, so let's just start with a very basic overview of galaxy cluster properties in case you don't typically think about galaxy clusters. So these are the largest gravitationally bound structures in the universe with total masses greater than about 10 to the 14 solar masses. And being these large gravitationally bound structures makes them very unique laboratories for studying galaxy evolution in detail. There are three basic components that make up their matter. And the most obvious one is, of course, what you can see with your eyes. So that's the matter in stars and gas, but it actually only makes up a tiny fraction of the matter budget in galaxy clusters. So the galaxies that you see and the stars within those galaxies and gas only makes up about 3% of the kind of this baryonic material within galaxy clusters. And that includes even the mass of this brightest cluster galaxy that lives at the center of the cluster potential well. Next, the galaxy cluster has 12% of its matter budget in what's called the intracluster medium. So this is a hot gas of electrons that's typically observed at X-ray wavelengths. And then finally, most of the matter budget in a galaxy cluster is in the form of dark matter. And I'm not going to be talking much about this in the talk, but just to say that, of course, we don't actually see the dark matter, but we infer it from the presence of gravitational arcs. And that what we've inferred in this galaxy cluster is shown as this blue light. And that's where most of the mass of a galaxy cluster lies within. All right, so just a quick cute cartoon to motivate why we look at cluster environments in the first place. So I've stolen this from Ari Chung, And I think I use it in almost every talk I give because I love it. So the idea here is that the cluster environment can be very hostile to galaxies as they enter into this environment. And we want to try to understand which of these mechanisms that are illustrated here is the primary mechanism for altering star formation within galaxies as they enter into this cluster environment. And you can distinguish these mechanisms into two broad categories. So on one hand, you have gravitational mechanisms. So these are things like tidal truncation, where you can have gravitation, where there can be gravitational tidal effects that disrupt the stellar components within galaxies and lead to morphological transformations over time. There are other gravitational interactions like harassment, where another galaxy might encounter other various galaxies in the cluster, which can then damage the shape of the galaxy disk. Or if galaxies are merging, they can produce, or flying by each other, they can produce these long tidal tails in a galaxy-galaxy encounter. So you can see there are various gravitational mechanisms that are illustrated on here. But in addition to that, there's also mechanisms that highlighted in pink here that involve the intracluster medium. So these are things like starvation, or sometimes known as thermal evaporation, where the outer hot halo of gas is removed and basically gets heated up by the intracluster medium. And so this is the gas that would, in the future, when I talked about that baryon cycle, cool and condense and fall back down onto the disk. So in essence, as this hot outer halo gets removed or gets heated up, or star from the galaxy, you're cutting off future fuel for star formation. And then there's also more kind of violent processes known as ram pressure stripping. And this occurs when you have a high velocity galaxy encountering a dense medium like the intracluster medium. And in this case, there's a strong dynamical pressure on the disk of the galaxy, so that it's actually capable, this pressure is capable of stripping some of the cold gas in the disk. So some of this gas that's already fallen and been accreted onto the disk is directly being removed. And this has what's thought to have a more immediate effect on altering or stopping the star formation, because you're removing the gas that's already directly in the disk that would go on soon to form stars. And the key points that I want you to take away from this slide is that by looking at the morphology of the gas and the stars, kind of how she's illustrated by the different colors, the blue and the pinks in this image, we can try to pinpoint which mechanisms might be responsible for quenching or shutting off star formation in cluster environments. So that kind of leads up to why we want to look at both the dust and the stars and the gas, and spatially resolve the observations as well to see the morphology. All right, so that answers why I care about cluster environments. So why do I also study higher redshifts? So we know, as I hinted at before, that the cosmic star formation rate density peaks when the universe was only about 4 billion years old. So around a redshift of 2 or so, and it's been declining ever since then. So obviously we want to, if we're trying to understand the process of star formation and what causes it to decline, we want to be studying kind of this regime around redshift 1.5, redshift 2. On the right-hand side, I'm showing what's known as the star-forming main sequence. So this is basically what's known as a tight correlation between star formation rate and stellar mass of a galaxy, where the normalization, so that's known as the main sequence, and the normalization of this main sequence increases with redshift and gets higher with redshift. So galaxies at a given mass have higher star formation rates at higher redshift. So again, we want to be studying kind of the peak epoch of the star formation to try to understand modes of star formation and what causes things to quench. So we don't really know, or for a while we didn't really know what was necessarily driving these trends in star formation, in the cosmic star formation rate density and in the star forming main sequence. And that kind of brings us to why we want to actually study the molecular gas components. So I'm just going to switch these two plots. It's probably going slow, but to two very similar plots. But now instead of looking at star formation rate tracers, we're looking at molecular gas mass tracers. So the left-hand side is showing now the cosmic decline in the decline in the cosmic molecular gas mass density as a function of redshift. And you can see the shape of this curve more or less mimics what we just saw in the shape of the cosmic star formation rate density. And this is done from a blind CO redshift survey with ALMA by DeCarli. And I think actually I should update this plot. I think they have even tighter constraints now from that group. On the right-hand side, I'm again showing this star forming main sequence, this correlation between star formation rate and stellar mass, but this time the galaxies on the main sequence have been color-coded by their fraction of molecular hydrogen. And what you'll notice is that this fraction varies across the main sequence for a given mass. So that's implying that the molecular gas is regulating the tightness of this correlation or the tightness of the main sequence. Which really makes sense because we know that galaxies are growing through an influx of fresh gas. So it's kind of reflects this gas regulator model. So now with ALMA, in its 8th year of observations, molecular gas studies have really taken off. So now ALMA is really able, and kind of what I want to highlight in this talk is all of the work I'm about to show really wasn't feasible in a practical way prior to ALMA. So ALMA is helping us push these molecular gas studies to higher redshifts in larger samples and pushing into these dense environments at high redshifts. So ALMA's really been quite revolutionary in these kinds of studies for molecular gas. And in the next few slides, then I want to really show and highlight some ALMA results from a few recent papers, and then also show some work that's currently ongoing. But just to kind of give a quick comparison, obviously the VLA is an incredible instrument and works at slightly different frequencies than ALMA, but they're both interferometers. One's a radio interferometer, one's a submillimeter interferometer, hence the slightly different frequency range or wavelength range. There is some overlap in frequencies around 50 to 80 gigahertz or so, or sorry. I think I had that backwards. Okay. There is actually no overlap. The VLA has 27 25-meter dishes, and ALMA has 50 12-meter dishes. So just as a kind of cute comparison on what we can do with molecular gas with the two different telescopes, with the two different interferometers, they're a program by a close collaborator of mine, Greg Rudnick, looked at molecular gas in 2 cluster galaxies at redshift 1.6, and it took 200 hours on the VLA. With ALMA, we're able to look at the same redshift, also in a galaxy cluster, But this time, in just 13 hours, we get 11 molecular gas detections. So there's an efficiency factor of almost 100 going between these two kinds of studies using VLA versus ALMA. So it's really helped kind of take this field off. All right, so I'm going to be focusing on, in this first half of the talk, 3 clusters at redshift 1.6 from SPARCS. So SPARCS is the Spitzer adaptation of the red sequence cluster survey. So it's an infrared selected cluster survey looking for overdensities of red galaxies. And because we use an infrared filter, it means the survey is optimized for finding high redshift clusters, which is helpful when we're trying to push further back in time. So the 3 clusters I'm going to focus on for this part of the talk are all at redshift 1.6, and they were chosen to follow up with ALMA due to their kind of wealth of ancillary data. So you can see here I've listed some of that data. We have 115 spectroscopically confirmed cluster members over all 3 systems. We've got 11 band photometry for stellar masses, from U-band all the way to 8 microns. We have MIPS and Herschel imaging, so mid-infrared to far-infrared imaging to get infrared-based star formation rates, which gives us a handle on kind of the total dusty star formation rate. And then we also have HST imaging at rest frame optical wavelengths to get sizes and morphology and morphologies of the stellar components within these galaxies. So once we take all of this ancillary data, we can combine these observations with new observations from ALMA to get the molecular gas, and then we really have a complete picture of the galaxy ecosystem, which within each of these systems, within these cluster galaxies. So here are these same 3 clusters, and now I'm overlaying our ALMA pointings or field of views on top of the 3 clusters. So in the first set of ALMA observations I'm going to be talking about, we had 13 hours of ALMA time to look at the CO 2-to-1 rotational transition in redshift 1.6 cluster galaxies. So we're targeting CO because this is the primary tracer for molecular hydrogen, since H2 is very difficult to detect, given it doesn't have a permanent dipole moment. So instead we use CO, and the 2-to-1 transition is the lowest redshift, the lowest transition you could get at this redshift with the current ALMA bands. So with these observations, we had some of the first molecular gas detections in cluster galaxies beyond redshift 1.5. You can see that an example of one of those detections, I'll go into a little more detail on these. The beam for these observations was quite large, around 4 by 2 arc seconds. So the galaxies were unresolved in this first set of observations. And we were really just interested then in measuring the global amounts, or the integrated amount of CO molecular gas in the galaxy. And just as a kind of quick refresher, if you're not used to thinking about interferometers, the power of ALMA or any interferometer is that you get this 3-dimensional data cube. So as opposed to just getting your 2D spatial information of intensity on the sky, you also get this 3rd axis in frequency or in velocity, and that's your data cube. And then you can, at the frequencies where there is emission, you can then map out the spectral profile of your line. So you then get both. You get the kind of the 2D morphology, if the galaxy were resolved. In this case, it's not. And then you also get the 3rd dimension in the spectral profile. So you can measure redshifts, and then you can measure gas masses by integrating under this line profile for CO. All right, so here's the gallery of our CO detections, or some of the CO detections for that first sample. So on the left-hand side is an HST image, and then on the right-hand side is a zoom out of the ALMA detection. Again, spatially unresolved, so it really fills up that entire plane of the HST image. The sample, of course, is still on the smaller side. It's still only 11 detections, but there were 0 detections in clusters before kind of ALMA came around to do this kind of work. So we're slowly chipping away at increasing these sample sizes. So the point to really get from here is that from HST, we're getting a handle on the stars in the galaxy. On ALMA, we're getting a handle on the molecular gas, and then not pictured, but from the infrared information from Spitzer and Herschel, we're getting a handle on the dust or the star formation rates. And we can put all these 3 components together to then try to understand the properties of these clustered galaxies. So the idea then is to compare the molecular gas detections to what we see in field galaxies at the same redshift, so in these isolated galaxies, and then check for any possible environmental effects on the molecular gas in the cluster galaxies. So what I'm showing on this plot is essentially the star formation rate on the y-axis, or offset from the star forming main sequence, where the horizontal line at 0 represents the main sequence at redshift 1.6. And on the x-axis, I'm showing the gas fraction. So this is now where you get those 3 different components that I highlighted in the last slide: your star formation rates, your stellar masses, and your gas masses. So the x-axis is gas fraction, or gas mass divided by the mass in stars and the mass in gas. And these blue lines, these tracks that I'm showing here, come from these scaling relations in field galaxies between these 2 properties. So these have all been normalized to redshift 1.6, because that's the redshift we're interested in for the Galaxie cluster. And then I've color-coded them by different stellar masses, just so you can kind of see the range in stellar masses that we're probing in our galaxies. This is then the range of the width kind of this correlation for field galaxies. And one of the main results to stem from this first ALMA program is that when we plot all of our cluster galaxies on top of these field relations, we notice that they all lie at systematically higher gas fractions than the field galaxy relations. So if you pick any circle of any given color, which is our cluster galaxy at a specific stellar mass, and you find the corresponding field scaling relation of the same color, you'll notice that the circle always lies to the right. So towards higher gas fractions for a given offset from the star forming main sequence. So there are many kind of possible explanations for what might be causing this kind of effect, these high gas fractions. And I don't have time to go through all of them, but I'm happy to talk about them more if there's time towards the end of the talk as well, because it includes some of the work that some students are doing right now as well. But it could be a selection effect. So we're looking into that by stacking some of the galaxies that are not detected in CO to look for an average gas mass in undetected sources. It could be high cluster-to-cluster variation. Really, in order to figure that one out, we just need more data at high redshift clusters. And if you're interested, I do have a few other clusters that are plotted on here that I can show later. But really what I want to focus on are these last few points. So whether it could be an environmental specific process, since I'm interested in the cluster environments, or related to that, the need to use a distinct conversion factor between the CO luminosity and the gas mass. So this is known as alpha CO. So if this is an environmental effect, it could be that the environment is perturbing the molecular gas in these cluster galaxies in such a way that a smaller fraction of the molecular gas is actively contributing to star formation. So essentially, it's not that their gas fractions are high, but that their star formation rates are low, is the other way you could look at it. If their gas fractions are indeed high for a given star formation rate, it could then be instead that gas secretion through cosmic filaments is being accelerated, and a few other people working on molecular gas and clusters at this redshift have pointed this out as a possibility, where they also see these high gas fractions. But I think kind of maybe an easy way to make this difference go away is by adapting a different alpha CO between cluster galaxies and field galaxies. So requiring that clusters have a distinct alpha CO. So our best estimate of alpha CO, or this kind of mass to light ratio, is from measurements of giant molecular clouds in the Milky Way. But of course, we can't get those types of measurements in high redshift galaxies. So we essentially just use the value for that's derived in the Milky Way towards these high redshift galaxies as well, which is not a crazy assumption if your galaxy is a normal main sequence star forming galaxy. And everything on this plot uses the same alpha CO value. But alpha CO is highly dependent on various factors. So for instance, metallicity might affect this mass to light ratio, mass surface density of the galaxy, and also gas velocity dispersions. And all of these things could be affected by the environment. So for example, if the gas velocity dispersions are higher in these cluster galaxies, we'd actually need to be using a lower alpha CO to put our galaxies in line with the field scaling relations. So in order to probe this a bit more, we decided to go for spatially resolved molecular gas observations in these galaxies. So we went a factor of 2 deeper and a factor of 10 higher spatial resolution to look at the molecular gas. And this is just a super convenient aspect of using an interferometer, because you can go back and observe the same objects, but have the dishes move further apart to very long, to large baselines, and then essentially you just get a complete new view of your galaxy. So our old observations had a resolution that looks like this, this large orange circle. So you might remember this is the HST image in the background. And I said the ALMA observations really covered that entire HST image. We weren't resolving anything on scales smaller than that. Our new ALMA observations were a factor of 10 times higher spatial resolution, and shown by that pink circle. So you can see we're now starting to probe the same spatial scales as the HST observations. Which is really nice if you're trying to look for differences in the gas and stellar components. The other kind of convenient aspect about this data that I want to highlight is that we focused on this galaxy because this was our galaxy that had the highest gas fraction. But because you have a fairly large field of view, well, it's about 70 arc seconds, fairly large on a cluster, it means that within the single pointing of ALMA, we were actually able to detect 7 additional galaxies for free. So in addition to this one detection, we actually got 8 detections in just 3 hours of ALMA integration time, which is a pretty quick proposal. So this is kind of a unique aspect of looking at high redshift galaxy clusters, because they are denser on the sky, and they are filled with more star-forming galaxies than low redshift clusters. So just within one single pointing, you can map out quite a few detections all in one go, instead of having to repoint. So here's another just image gallery trying to show what some of these observations look like. So on the left-hand side, I'm showing, again, the HST image overplotted with these pink contours, which are integrated intensity contours and signal to noise from ALMA. And on the right-hand panel of each of those, I'm showing the rotation or the velocity map that you can measure from the data cube. So what's exciting about this data was how clearly we were able to see rotation in the molecular gas disks through these kind of smooth velocity gradients in color, going from red to blue or purple on these maps. So quite a few of the galaxies, but not all, looked to have kind of this ordered rotation in the molecular gas disk, which is what we see in field galaxies as well. But we also had, remember I said there were 8 detections, so these are the other 4. They're slightly lower signal to noise, and these galaxies showed a little more, were a little more nuanced, let's say. So they had some kinematic asymmetries, such as these single-sided gas tails. So you can see that there's in the contours, in the pink or the white contours, which are the same, they have these asymmetric gas tails. And in many cases, those gas tails are pointing towards the center of the cluster. We also see in at least 2 of the systems, there is quite a large offset between the gas and stellar centroid. So that would be, you can see that in the HST image for the bottom left galaxy and the top right galaxy. There is an offset between the blue contours and the pink contours. And these features, these gas tails and centroid offsets, could be indicative of perturbed gas in the galaxy or ram pressure stripping. So the other kind of low-hanging fruit that we can do with this data set is just measure the size of the CO disk, of the molecular gas disk, and then compare it to that of the stellar disk. So when we can then compare the distribution of these size ratios in both clusters and in field galaxies. So on the top, I'm showing the distribution of sizes in clusters, and on the bottom in field galaxies over a little bit larger range of redshift. And obviously with 8 galaxies, we can't really say much. That's not surprising. So you don't really see any difference between these 2 populations. The best you can do is say that there's about a 1 sigma offset in the mean. So the top distribution in the cluster galaxies shows a higher mean ratio, meaning the CO gas disks are on average slightly smaller than their stellar components. To try to contextualize any difference between these 2 populations in the high redshift field, high redshift population, we also looked at low redshifts. So we compared Virgo cluster on the top with the low redshift field. And here you can see that the low redshift field looks pretty much the same as the high redshift fields. They both have a mean ratio of 1. But the Virgo cluster has a markedly different distribution, with this tail out to much higher ratios. So the galaxies that have smaller CO disks. And again, this is indicative of what you might expect from gas stripping. So it remains to be seen whether we can, with a larger sample, see kind of this same tail in stripped galaxies and the cluster environment at high redshift, but just an advertisement that we are now looking into that. So we have 20 more hours of ALMA time where we've spatially observed molecular gas in something like an additional 15 cluster galaxies. So our total sample should be on the order of 20 or so. And I have a student working on trying to look at these CO sizes and offsets in a little more detail. All right, so coming back to this cartoon, I showed this cartoon earlier to demonstrate the various mechanisms that can alter or quench star formation within galaxies. And I said we can get a handle on this by looking at the morphology of the gas and stars in galaxies. So now if we kind of look back to what I've just showed in those two ALMA programs, I'm going to argue that based on the results from that pilot program, which is to be confirmed with the new data that we're currently analyzing, but based on the results, we have tentative evidence for ram pressure stripping in these high redshift cluster environments. So we see kind of all of these tails, which doesn't look so unsimilar or dissimilar to what we saw in our cartoon towards the beginning. All right, so I'm realizing I'm running a bit short on time here, so I'll try to go through this a little quickly because I have a second part that's shorter that I want to try to get through. So at first glance, these redshift 1.6 cluster galaxies generally look like field galaxies. They've got typical main sequence star formation rates. They have rotating gas disks, or some of them do, but they also exhibit these potentially important differences from field galaxies in that they have elevated gas fractions. They have slightly smaller CO disks compared to their stars, to the size of the stellar component. And a few of them are showing these evidence for gas tails. And I think that this is indicating that these galaxies are undergoing modest molecular gas stripping. And I think if they are undergoing modest molecular gas stripping, that could also explain these high gas fractions. So if the stripping is causing the gas to become compressed at the leading edge, a lower alpha CO conversion would be required to get the correct gas mass out. So if the galaxies are undergoing stripping and then we lower the alpha CO, they will no longer have high gas fractions, they'll have just normal gas fractions compared to the field. So this is all kind of work that we're continuing on with larger samples. But I think one of the main points from this part of the talk is also that these high redshift clusters are clearly exciting prospects for detecting gas-rich galaxies because you get these spatially resolved observations with not too much time from ALMA. Just to quickly kind of highlight what I think is coming next in this field. So I already talked about how we're using the larger data set now that we have to do more detailed kinematic analyses of all these galaxies, measure velocity dispersions, dynamical masses, etc. And then in the near future, I hope to measure a spatially resolved Kennekitt-Schmidt for these cluster galaxies. So looking at the star formation efficiency in kiloparsec scales. So we have an approved HST program to look at rest frame UV imaging to get star formation rates for these galaxies. And then there's quite a few other places where we could get more follow-up data with more ALMA data, getting H-alpha, and then of course everyone wants James Webb. So that is part one, but the parts are not equal. So part two is a bit shorter. So I'll try to go through that a little more quickly. But here, remember, I'm going to be folding in these axes of mass and time to look at studies of brightest cluster galaxies over cosmic time. And again, mostly focusing on ALMA, looking at dust continuum and molecular gas. All right. Brightest cluster galaxies are the galaxies that typically reside at the center of a galaxy cluster. It's oftentimes a single galaxy, can be more than one galaxy, but it's much more luminous or bright than the rest of the cluster population. And so there are these dominant kind of galaxies that have their own mass growth, history of mass growth and evolution. So we don't fully understand their formation process or how they're growing in mass, but we do think that it seems likely that it's linked to the cluster parent halo, and that it's also linked to fundamental processes like gas cooling, star formation, energy feedback, and galaxy accretion, all at the centers of these giant dark matter halos of clusters. We see a diversity of brightest cluster galaxies over cosmic time. So if you look at high redshifts like redshift 2, when clusters aren't fully virialized, you don't necessarily see one BCG, but you see a lot of things coming together in the center that will eventually merge into a BCG. At intermediate redshifts, we've seen examples of BCGs that are being fueled by cooling flows. So these are filaments of cold gas that's being funneled into the center of the galaxy cluster and forming stars at the center of the cluster potential. And then at low redshifts, we've seen kind of the canonical BCG example, which is just this giant elliptical galaxy that's not doing anything in the sense that it's not forming stars, it's quiescent. And it's much more luminous than any other galaxy. But because BCGs are often picked out by looking at which galaxy is the most luminous in a single waveband, having this diversity of BCG properties can really complicate or bias what you might actually pick out as the BCG. So if we want to try to answer questions like when does the BCG become the dominant galaxy, the first question we actually need to answer is how do we actually identify the BCG in an unbiased way? So to do that, I've been working on a probabilistic approach to identifying the BCG in large samples of galaxy clusters. So instead of picking out the BCG in a single waveband, we're using multiple bands to determine probability distributions for every galaxy within the cluster field in both their redshift distribution, their probability redshift distribution, and their PDF of stellar mass. So we then randomly pick from each of these probability distributions in redshift and mass. We randomly pick a redshift and a mass for every galaxy within the field, and we then decide which galaxy lives in the cluster and is the most massive. And then we do that, we Monte Carlo it, and we iterate on that, 1,000 or a few thousand times, and build up a BCG likelihood for every galaxy in the cluster field. So instead of just picking out the one galaxy now, every single galaxy will have some range between 0% and 100% of being the BCG. So just to show kind of an example of how this works on obvious data. So I tested the pipeline on some lower redshift BCGs where we know, easily by eye, you can say where the BCG is in this image. And when I run all of the galaxies in this image, or actually beyond this image, through the pipeline, this galaxy, luckily, comes out with a 99.99% chance of being the BCG. If we then put this pipeline through a slightly more complicated case, this is the smiley face galaxy, which is known to have a possible BCG merger. What you get then is a 72% probability for the galaxy on the left and a 26% probability for the galaxy on the right of being the BCG. So now when you try to study BCG properties in large statistical samples, you can assign a weight based on the probability to each of those galaxy properties. So instead of just saying only galaxy on the left is the BCG with 100% certainty, you say they're both BCGs and weight their properties by these probabilities. So just quickly, once the BCG is identified, the question then is, the main question we want to answer is how they're growing over cosmic time. So here I'm showing a redshift, a survey out to redshift 2 of infrared identified BCGs. And what you'll notice is that at low redshift, most BCGs have little to no star formation. But this increases to about 30% by redshift 1.5. So at low redshift, we think BCGs are growing through dry mergers because there's not we don't see much star formation occurring in these low redshift BCGs. At high redshift, there's an increase in the star formation or the fraction of star forming BCGs. And the question is what is the dominant growth mechanism at higher redshifts? Could it be cooling flows or is it gas-rich mergers? And to answer that, I don't have an answer, but I'll show you just quickly in the last few slides two studies that we're working on now to try to get a handle on this. So here I'm showing some preliminary images of star-forming brightest cluster galaxies over a range of redshifts. So from redshift 0.7 to 1.7, where we know BCGs have more star formation. And qualitatively, we can say for now that the sources are looking kind of quite interesting and diverse. Some of them are showing this extended emission with some clumps. Others look centrally concentrated, and a few have these possible kind of tidal-like tails, which could be indicative of maybe mergers. So the idea is to morphologically classify these systems and then measure any asymmetric features and try to understand what might be the dominant mechanism for growth in these galaxies. And it's really just kind of a pilot project for what I hope will become a larger project. So we have 26 BCGs, spatially resolved dust continuum right now with ALMA. And then another project that's being worked on right now by a student at McGill, who was an undergraduate there, is to look at, of course, then molecular gas. So in addition to just looking at the dust continuum, also looking at how the gas is being deposited onto the BCG. So this was another ALMA program. We have molecular gas detections in 24 BCGs from redshifts 0.2 to 1.2. Those are two separate samples, the ones I'm highlighting here. And she's currently in the process of writing this up now. So stay tuned for results on that. All right, in the interest of time, I think I'm going to skip what's next for BCGs, but essentially it's kind of an expansion of what I was already saying, and go to kind of my conclusions for the two parts of the talk. So part one, we see evidence for higher gas fractions and evidence for gas stripping. And then just this idea that these high redshift clusters are clearly exciting prospects for detecting gas-rich galaxies. And then in part two, this new approach of statistically identifying BCGs through a Bayesian analysis. That result I'm working on should come out soon. And then also just highlighting some of these ongoing ALMA programs that we're working on to try to understand the mass growth in BCGs over cosmic time. So just to kind of wrap everything up, I think these current facilities like ALMA are really paving the way for this first census of spatially resolved molecular gas and dust continuum. And future upgrades to ALMA and also the proposed NGVLA will move us to even higher spatial resolutions and higher redshifts, and possibly new windows into neutral hydrogen with SKA. Combining that with space-based sensitivity of James Webb, which is going to be an excellent probe of star formation and also stellar content on high resolution scales. And then adding on to that, kind of 10 years from now, a bit further in the future, these ground-based 30-meter class telescopes, which will provide diffraction-limited imaging and spectroscopy with infrared integral field units and AO technology. So I think combining kind of all of those instruments and facilities, and by studying the molecular gas, the star formation and the stellar components in this extraordinary detail at spatially resolved resolutions, these facilities will really provide this extremely detailed view into the ecosystem of galaxies out to high redshifts, and answer many of these kind of outstanding questions on galaxy evolution and the baryon cycle for the first time. So I'll leave you there with any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Allison, for the very interesting talk. We now have time for questions from the audience.
May I?
Of course, please go on.
Hi, Allison. Thank you very much for the presentation. Very pedagogical. Let me ask you a question. As you may know, one way of identifying clusters like, of galaxies in this wide field surveys is basically using the red sequence and identifying BCGs and things like that. From your experience, the red sequence is well defined in which redshift range? I mean, I'm talking about 1-ish, 1.3. Can you actually tell that the red sequence already is well established?
Yeah, so it depends on what filters you're using, because you want to be basically bracketing that 4,000 angstrom break in those galaxies to find
up to Z-band. We include the Z-band.
Yeah, so if you use something like Z-band and 3.6 microns as your red filter, you'll be sensitive anywhere between about, I think, redshifts of 0.3-ish all the way to 1.2-ish or so, 1.3-ish. To get beyond that redshift, a technique that people often use now is called the stellar bump sequence. So they use kind of those filters, and then also a combination with 4.5 microns to identify the stellar bump feature at 1.6 microns.
But my question is, I mean, are the ellipticals there? Not just to find them, but are they there?
Oh,
already?
Yeah, they're there. Yeah, so they're there. There's definitely a red sequence. So there's the question isn't just that it's not that the red sequence is disappearing at redshift 1.5. It's just that there is a higher fraction of star-forming galaxies, or a lower fraction of quiescent galaxies. Mm-hmm. So if you, for example, let me just see if I can find a slide that I think is hidden, so maybe I won't be able to see it here. Just let me exit quickly. All right. All right. Oh, bear with me because it goes to piecewise. But if you look at the passive fraction, so you're right in that the passive fraction is decreasing at higher redshifts, but up to redshift 1, the passive fraction at most stellar masses is still kind of 70%. So you still have quite a strong red sequence up to redshift 1. And it's really only at redshift 1.5 where we start to see this decrease in the passive fraction. But still only 50%, right? So you still have a well-formed red sequence with 50% of your galaxies, even at redshift 1.6, are populating that red sequence. It's just that you also see this kind of increase in quenching efficiency occurring between redshift 1.5 and 1. So that's where a lot of the quenching is taking place. Mm-hmm. But there is still a red sequence to be found up to these redshifts.
Yeah, but we also point out something very interesting, that the problem of identifying the BCG, mm-hmm. because this is actually used, to define the center of the clusters, and therefore has an implication about the richness estimate of the cluster. So I'm talking about, you know, wide angle survey. So that's great, very interesting. I mean, your Bayesian approach is also very cool. Okay.
Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah. Hopefully, the results that I'm working on with that, the pipeline is up and running, and I could show something quickly from those results. I didn't want to highlight them too much because they're still in progress.
No, but we are very interested in it.
Yeah, so this is an example of the things I'm trying to do with that Bayesian analysis. So, of course, the benefit of using this probabilistic approach is that you can calculate something like the mass gap. So the mass of the brightest cluster galaxy, the mass of the most massive galaxy related to the mass of the second most massive galaxy. And you can do that in every iteration and build up an entire distribution of mass gaps so that you're accounting for kind of the uncertainty in what actually is the BCG as you do it. So here I've taken all of those distributions that I get from running this probability code thousands of times, and then I'm also stacking the histograms in redshift space. And what you see is perhaps what you would expect, is that at high redshifts, so up to a redshift of 0.7 or so right now, where I'm looking, there's a very sharp peak where, you know, there's very little mass gap between the most massive galaxy and the second most massive galaxy, and there's a small tail towards other mass gaps. And as you go to lower and lower redshift, this tail comes further and further out towards higher mass gaps. So at redshift 0, then you can see where, or between redshift 0 and 0.25, you can see that the BCG is really becoming dominant in the sense that it's becoming much more massive than the next massive galaxy, because this tail doesn't exist in the higher redshift bins. So
that's really interesting.
Yeah, I'm still
important, actually. Okay.
Yeah, so I'm hoping this will kind of give us some handle on answering that question of when BCGs become the most dominant galaxy. But I'm still working on kind of quantifying these results, and then also extending it to some of the higher redshift bins where the photometry gets worse, or the uncertainties get larger in the photometry, so everything just spreads out naturally. So trying to then kind of uncover what the actual mass gap is a little more difficult.
Well, that's great. Thank you.
Yeah.
And thank you for coming.
Yeah, of course.
Thank you, Luis. We can have a last very quick question. Okay, so I will ask a very basic question, Allison. I'm not from the field, and you just trying to learn a little bit more on the topic. So you showed some plots where you were measuring the velocity from the gas, and I was wondering if the gas velocities are the same as the galaxy denser regions, and if it has something to do with stellar formation rate. And also, what does the amount of CO2 in a galaxy represents, actually? What does it has a role?
Say that last part again.
What the amount of CO2 that you found in the molecular gas represents? So.
Right, okay, so you're asking about these velocity maps?
Yeah.
Yeah, so here, so right now we're working actually on doing, in this paper that I show from 2019, we didn't talk too much about the kinematics, and we are working through more detailed kinematic properties of these galaxies. So I don't have anything quantitative to say right now on the kinematics, because we're still working through those results. But your question, I think, was, your other question was how it relates to
yes, what the amount of CO2, because you were studying some wavelength to detect CO2. What does the amount of CO2 represents in a galaxy?
Yeah, okay, so we're using CO, the carbon monoxide, the 2-to-1 transition in CO. So that's a rotational transition. And we're using the CO to get a handle on the total molecular gas, which is primarily molecular hydrogen. But molecular hydrogen, H2, is difficult to detect because there's no permanent dipole, whereas the rotational transition of carbon monoxide is very easy to detect and very luminous. So when I was talking about using that alpha CO conversion, going from I think here, going from the CO luminosity to a total molecular gas mass, that's what you're using the CO for. So you're measuring a CO luminosity, but then you're making an assumption that that CO luminosity translates into some amount of molecular hydrogen. And there is a huge uncertainty in that conversion factor, that alpha CO that's listed there. So the x-axis on this plot, the gas fraction, is talking about the molecular hydrogen, which is the dominant gas in the galaxy, but we're measuring that through the carbon monoxide 2-to-1 line transition. Does that make sense?
Yes, sure, very much. Thank you, very interesting. Well, I will assume that there are no more questions. We are a little bit behind schedule, so we will now wrap this up. This presentation will be available on our website and on LIneA's YouTube channel. So for the next week webinar, we will have Mireia Quiles from the University of New South Wales talking about intra-cluster light. Thank you everyone for attending, and a special thanks to Allison.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah. Everyone have a great day and see you next week.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.